Thank you very much for the introduction, Dr. Borman. I'm going to start with some background information. So prior to weaning, dairy calves have a very high risk for morbidity. And some of the most common causes for this morbidity is both respiratory illness as well as digestive illnesses. According to the latest NOM study, 18.1% of pre-weaned dairy calves will experience a respiratory illness and 25.3% will experience a digestive illness. And the most common way to treat these illnesses is through the use of antibiotics. However, due to a more recent growing concern for antibiotic-resistant bacteria, the use of antibiotics has kind of been, the need for it has been reduced. So we want to try to reduce the amount of antibiotics that we are using on our calves. And due to this, it has led for increase in other areas and other ways that we can improve immune function in calves so that we don't need to treat with antibiotics as much. And this brings us to yeast fermentation products. So yeast fermentation products, this is when yeast is fermented, it produces products such as amino acids, organic acids, lipids, as well as B vitamins. And so these products have been shown to improve rumen fermentation, as well as to improve the amount of beneficial bacteria that is present in the gut. In lactating dairy cows, yeast fermentation products are commonly fed, and they have shown to increase production parameters, so increasing both milk production as well as fat and protein yield in milk. And so the question is, how can yeast fermentation products potentially benefit the health and the growth of calves? So that brings me to the materials and methods of my study. So we used 60 Holstein bull calves that were divided into 2 different batches of 30 each. And then we blocked based on their initial body weight as well as serum total protein. And then this study had 2 treatments. So we had a control treatment and a yeast fermentation product treatment. The yeast fermentation product treatment, calves that received that treatment had this product present in their milk replacer, their calf starter, as well as 2 different growers that we fed them throughout this study. And then the control calves did not receive this yeast fermentation products in those feed sources. And then calves were individually housed from day 0 to day 58. And then they were group housed from day 59 to day 112, which was the end of our study. Calves were weaned at day 56. And then I did want to mention, so I'm not going to be reporting on this data in this presentation just because it's a lot and not all of the analysis is complete. But in the second batch of calves, 10 calves from each treatment, so 20 of those 30 calves experienced an LPS challenge at day 50 and 51, so just prior to weaning. And an LPS challenge is going to look at their immune status and their immune function to see if we saw any differences in treatments. So just keep that in mind when I go through some of my data that also occurred right around weaning in some of these calves. And then we looked at bi-weekly body measurements, so body weight, body condition score, hip width, and hip height. And then we also recorded daily intake as well as daily fecal scores and respiratory scores. And then we also noted any treatment incidences that occurred. So jumping into my results, there were no treatment differences for body weight, body condition score, hip width, or hip height. And then if we look at average daily gains, so prior to weaning, there were no differences based on treatment. However, post-weaning, we did see a tendency for increased average daily gain in our yeast fermentation product calves. So this figure, you can see I marked with an arrow the time point that weaning as well as that LPS challenge would have occurred. And you can see that prior to that, we don't really see any differences based on treatment. And then there were 2 specific time points post-weaning, so 2 specific 2-week time periods where there were some differences based on treatment. And then that led to an overall tendency for increased average daily gain post-weaning. And then we also looked at intake and feed efficiency. And so intake and feed efficiency prior to weaning, we didn't see any treatment differences. And then post-weaning group intake, we did not see any differences. However, feed efficiency, we did see that our yeast fermentation product calves had greater feed efficiency post-weaning. And then looking at medical treatments, so we divided our medical treatments into whether they received a treatment based on digestive concerns or based on respiratory illness. And so for digestive illnesses, we didn't see any differences based on the amount that we were treating. However, for respiratory illness, we saw that our control calves had significantly greater incidence of respiratory disease and were therefore treated at a much higher rate compared to our yeast fermentation product calves. And then this figure that I included shows the health probability of our calves. So the blue line is our control and the red is our yeast fermentation product calves. And so we want it to be high because that's showing that they're healthy. That's the probability that they'll stay healthy. And you can see that from early on in our study, our control calves already had a reduced health probability, which means that they're going to have increased risk of illness and therefore be treated more for respiratory disease. And then, like I also mentioned, we did daily respiratory and fecal scores, and we did not see any differences based on those for treatment. And so in conclusion, yeast fermentation products did improve average daily gain as well as feed efficiency post-weaning. So our thought behind this is that weaning is a stressful event. Some of these calves received an LPS challenge, which is also stressful, that this yeast fermentation product could help to reduce these negative side effects that are seen with stress. And then also we saw a reduced risk for respiratory illness, which means we medicated less frequently in our yeast fermentation product calves, which again, just therefore reduces antibiotic use. And then just some further data that we're still looking at with this study. Like I mentioned, we did an LPS challenge to look at immune function. So we still have some acute phase proteins and cytokines to analyze to see how that differed based on treatment. And then throughout the study, we also did some fecal samples where we're going to look at fecal microbiome. And with that, I thank you very much for your time. And if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. Thank you.